Good morning, everyone. Welcome to today's session, Delivering Blended Teaching and Learning, How is it done? This session highlights ways in which schools can deliver blended teaching and learning and remotely support their pupils using digital teaching and learning tools. Today's session is due to last approximately 45 minutes. Just to let you know that I will be recording this session and we will be sharing the link to the video afterwards. So there is no need to make notes unless you wish to do so. For people who haven't met me before, my name is Paul and I work for SCOMIS as an education product specialist. I've worked in education and IT for over 20 years, and this morning's session is one of a number of SCOMIS virtual events that we are running this term. And over the coming weeks, I will be presenting on some additional SCOMIS virtual events, and some of these will showcase Microsoft's and Google's digital learning platforms in more detail. But more details about all of our virtual events that we are running this term can be found on the SCOMIS website, www.scomis.org. Okay, so I'm just going to turn the camera off and make a start proper. So during this session, we will cover the types of teaching and learning platforms available via the DfE's funded scheme and ways in which cloud technology and strategies can be effectively used for remote teaching and learning. We'll have a look at some of the digital tools and techniques that can make learning interactive, engaging and accessible, and how schools can apply for government funding for a remote learning platform and the eligibility criteria that the DfE use for funding. We'll then turn to have a look at ways in which SCOMIS can help with all of the above. And finally, if time allows, we have a Q&A session at the end. So if you have any specific questions as we go along, please feel free to drop them into the Teams chat. So let's start by looking at what platforms are available under the DfE scheme and how they support teaching and learning. As you'll be aware, the DfE guidance recommends that schools have contingency plans in place to provide uninterrupted education in the case of a local lockdown or in cases where staff and students are required to self-isolate. And the terminology the DfE use for remote teaching and learning system is a digital education platform. And the DfE have publicised funded access to one of two systems, and these are Microsoft 365 for Education and Google's G Suite for Education. And this is currently undergoing a rebranding and will be known as Google Workspace for Education in the future. And I'll summarise the eligibility criteria for the DfE funding later on in today's session. Now, in terms of the DfE expectations, I've highlighted some specific points on the screen taken from the DfE guidance. There are many more expectations on the DfE website, but essentially in developing contingency plans, DfE expects schools to use a curriculum sequence which allows pupils access to high quality resources, and these have to be linked to the school's curriculum. Choose online tools that will be consistently used across the school in order to allow interaction, assessment and feedback. Differentiate work and plan a programme that is equivalent length to the core teaching that pupils would receive in school, and this should include daily contact with teachers. So, in other words, the DfE expects schools to give their pupils a virtual equivalent of their normal school education, but using remote delivery methods. Fortunately, government-funded support is available to schools to get set up on either G Suite for Education or Microsoft 365 for Education, and both of these cloud-based learning platforms use a classroom app, Google Classroom or Microsoft Teams. And not only do these online systems allow schools to manage and deliver lessons remotely, but they can also help schools to communicate and collaborate in new and different ways. Due to COVID, many pupils will rotate between studying at school and at home for the foreseeable future. But the benefits to schools of adopting a digital education platform will remain long into the future, even after COVID. So I just wanted to mention a bit about blended learning. The term blended learning has been around for many years, And put very simply, blended learning is the use of technology as a teaching resource to enrich learning. And it's traditionally combined having the teacher physically in the classroom with the students, but with the student having the control to work at their own level and pace using technology as a learning resource within the classroom. Now, back in March, which seems a very long time ago now, we went through a period where schools suddenly shut down due to lockdown, and schools very quickly had to move to remote learning as the majority of students were no longer in the school. Since September, when schools fully returned, we've got into a far more mixed environment. And in many ways, this is a far more difficult space for schools to operate in, as many schools now have some pupils being taught in school, as well as some pupils being taught at home. And in essence, hybrid learning is that mixture of face-to-face and remote learning. The combination of delivering on and off-site teaching can be very challenging, and potentially it's more difficult teaching both on and off-site than teaching all online, which we were doing in the summer term, or all face-to-face that we have traditionally done. Now, when it comes to hybrid learning, you often hear people talk about synchronous and asynchronous learning. Synchronous learning is where we're doing things together at the same time, more like traditional teaching in a school classroom. So today's live session, which you are watching and that you're able to comment on live using the chat feature, means we are currently participating in synchronous learning together. We are all covering these materials at the same time and progressing at the same rate. But there might be some people who are watching the recording of this session next week or in a month's time, and they will be accessing this asynchronously. Asynchronous learning has the benefits in that people can watch in their own time, move around the subject, pause, and maybe even skip certain sections. And therefore, they are controlling their own learning in that respect. And so schools need to think about which approach is most appropriate for their students. When we participate in synchronous learning, everyone's learning at the same time. The teacher is in charge and the teacher is controlling the pace of the learning. And this mirrors the traditional classroom way of teaching. And there can be some big advantages to this, because if we're delivering synchronous learning online or face-to-face, we can follow a timetable and keep everyone on the same track. This means that students can connect with each other as they're learning in the same space together, meaning that learning is a social activity. And if we're learning online, we have that option to ask questions to others and get instant feedback. So it's a far more interactive piece of learning. And so as a teacher, you can respond and react to what the students need. Now, most of you will have had a lesson which was planned to go in one direction, and then a student's asked a really valid question, or maybe you've uncovered a misunderstanding and you've needed to take the lesson in a very different direction than the one you planned. And obviously, synchronous learning, with everyone learning at the same pace at the same time, allows teachers to read the room or to look at the chat and decide where things are going and to decide what direction and action to take. So that's one of the huge advantages of synchronous learning. Another big advantage is it can reduce teacher workload, because the lesson is delivered once in real time. So it could be delivered to students physically in your class, as well as being live streamed remotely to students who are working from home, which is all well and good if all students working from home have access to a device on the internet at the exact time you are delivering the class. It can also be tricky when delivering a face-to-face lesson in school to ensure that remote students can still interact and communicate with what's going on in the lesson, and to ensure students in the classroom aren't dominating proceedings to the detriment of students participating online. So, questions that teachers need to consider if they're going to use synchronous real-time learning in a hybrid scenario with some students physically learning in school and some students remotely learning at home. The alternative is to deliver asynchronous learning. Fortunately, modern learning platforms allow teachers to distribute resources electronically, which allows students to easily learn at their own pace and at the time of their choosing. This method of delivery is particularly useful for remote students who don't have exclusive access to a home device during the school day. And asynchronous learning allows students to learn at their own pace and have more time when working through materials. Students are able to repeat and revisit work for revision and reinforcement. Asynchronous learning can give students more autonomy to focus on the things they are interested in by giving them access to a wider variety of study materials. But consideration needs to be given to additional support structures when using asynchronous learning. Fortunately, there are many ways in which teachers and students can communicate asynchronously using a digital learning platform. The biggest consideration of asynchronous learning is that this method of delivery can be particularly isolating for students, which could be to the detriment of their own well-being and mental health. So it's vitally important to always build in a level of interaction with some social communication. It's still possible to foster teamwork between students whilst delivering learning in a hybrid environment, with some students attending in school and some students working from home. Fortunately, a digital education platform is a space where pupils' learning can continue outside of school as close to normal as possible. And by using your professional judgment and experience of lesson delivery, you already know what areas of the curriculum are well catered for by resources that already exist online. So you might already be using resources such as YouTube, BBC Learning Resources, Oak Academy in your traditional classroom lessons. But by incorporating these pre-created internet resources into your virtual lessons, pupils will be able to achieve their learning outcomes without necessarily creating additional teacher workload. Google and Microsoft both offer free subscription plans to education providers. And with each solution, users get access to Office apps, email, calendars, classroom, and video conferencing tools. And all of these can be accessed via a web browser. So you get web versions of Outlook, Word, Excel, and PowerPoint from Microsoft, or the Google equivalents, which are Gmail, Google Docs, Google Sheets, and Google Slides from Google. Both of these solutions also come with cloud storage for users and cloud storage for shared areas. And most schools find that they just need this free of charge core functionality for delivery of remote learning using a web browser. But both Microsoft Teams and Google Classroom offer a core package of tools, also accessible via a web browser, without the need to have software installed on that device the pupils are using. And these online classroom tools make it simple for teachers to send out class materials, grade assignments, and monitor pupils' progress. And these learning platforms have been specifically designed for the delivery of remote learning in a really engaging and intuitive way that school websites and school email aren't designed for. And you don't need to reinvent the wheel. You can use your existing resources you've previously created for use in the classroom, which may already be in electronic form of documents, presentations, links, and videos, and incorporate these into your online lessons, all of which can be organized and shared with your pupils using either Microsoft Teams or Google Classroom. But prior to sharing any content, it's just worth considering the format and design of your materials to ensure accessibility for all. And in these unprecedented circumstances, a digital education platform such as G Suite for Education or Microsoft 365 for Education is going to be the closest alternative that you have to a real classroom setting. And I guess the trick with delivering hybrid learning is to exploit the digital tools to the best effect without creating huge increases in your workload. It's really about working smarter rather than having to work harder. And it's not really about trying to change the way that you teach. Teachers know how to teach. It's more about using the technology to learning to pupils. And future SCOMIS virtual events will look in more detail at the specific use of teaching tools in both the Microsoft and Google learning platforms, but for now I'd just like to give you a flavour of what can be done. Google and Microsoft both offer really comprehensive digital learning platforms for education, and the platform that is best suited for your school, academy or trust is likely to depend on your specific preferences.